It started as a harmless escape from the city, the kind of weekend trip that promised nothing more than fresh air, good company, and the blissful absence of phone signals. Blackwood Forest was notorious, sure. Every town has its stories, its local legends. But we laughed them off. After all, we were young, restless, and eager to trade in the stress of daily life for a couple of nights around a campfire, with nothing but the stars above us. I remember the sky that evening. It was unusually vivid, deep bloody oranges and purples that melted into each other as the sun dipped behind the trees. There was something about the way the forest swallowed the light, though. It felt like we were stepping into a different world, one where the rules shifted just a little. But I shrugged it off. We all did. The first few hours were normal. We set up camp, cracked open some beers, and let ourselves unwind. The woods were still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or distant owl hoots. Our laughter echoed around the clearing, filling the void left by the forest's unsettling silence. Then came the stories. We couldn't help ourselves. Ghost tales, urban legends, those things you share around a fire when you want to see who cracks first. Mark was the first to break the mood. I noticed him staring into the tree line, his face pale, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. We turned, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Still, the way he said it, the way his voice trembled ever so slightly, it set something off in all of us. We tried to laugh it off, tease him a bit, but it didn't feel right anymore. The laughter felt forced, brittle. That was when the unease started, creeping in like a cold draft that you couldn't quite shake. Sarah was next. She shivered, pulling her jacket tight around her, and I swear, she looked at me like she knew something was wrong, though she couldn't put it into words. It was subtle at first. The crackling of the fire seemed too loud against the stillness. The night had closed in around us, and the darkness was oppressive, like it was pushing in from all sides. It felt alive. I know it sounds ridiculous now, but there was this presence, like the forest itself was watching us. I tried to keep myself calm, but every snap of a twig or gust of wind set my heart racing. I could feel it, the weight of something unseen lurking just outside the light of the fire. Sarah and Mark weren't talking anymore. Neither was I. It was like we had all collectively decided to let the silence wrap around us, suffocate us. We went to bed early. No one said it, but I think we were all hoping that sleep would make it go away. But sleep didn't come. I lay in my tent, staring up at the flimsy fabric ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. That's when I heard it. A scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It was this raw, guttural sound, like something was being torn apart. My body went cold. I bolted upright, my pulse thudding in my ears, and I could hear the others scrambling out of their tents. We met by the fire, our faces pale in the dim glow of the embers. Mark was shaking, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's out there." The air was heavy, thick with a silence that felt wrong. We all turned, our eyes searching the darkness, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the trees, standing unnaturally still, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch out in ways they shouldn't. And its eyes, God, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, piercing the darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. It was like our bodies refused to acknowledge what our minds were screaming at us. Then the figure shifted, and I swear it reached out toward us. That's when panic hit. Full-blown, gut-wrenching terror. We grabbed whatever we could, backpacks, car keys, and bolted. No one said a word. We didn't need to. The only thing that mattered was getting the hell out of there. The drive back was a blur. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the car on the road. Sarah was sobbing quietly in the back seat, and Mark just kept muttering to himself, "It's real, it's real, it's real." I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I was terrified that if I did, I'd see those glowing eyes staring back at me. We never talked about it after that night, not once. We went back to our normal lives, pretending it didn't happen, that we didn't see what we saw. But Blackwood Forest, it's always there, in the back of my mind. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still feel it. That presence, watching, waiting. I never went back to the forest. I don't think any of us did. But I wonder sometimes if it's still out there, waiting for its next victims, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, where the light can't quite reach. And sometimes I'm almost sure it is. The sun was already beginning to set as I set off on what I thought would be a short solo trek through the well-marked trails of Hemlock Ridge. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing, and the vibrant reds and golds of the turning leaves created a sense of tranquility I hadn't felt in a long time. It was exactly what I needed. A break from the noise of the world, some time alone to clear my head. I had been hiking for about an hour, my thoughts drifting, when I noticed something was off. The familiar trail markers I'd been following were gone. At first I wasn't too worried. I'd hiked these woods before and figured I could find my way back easily enough. But as I kept moving, it became clear I had taken a wrong turn. The terrain was unfamiliar, and the trees seemed to grow denser with every step, blocking out what little light remained. The sun was now barely a sliver on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe, playing tricks on my eyes. I tried not to panic, but a growing unease gnawed at me. I pulled out my phone to check the map, only to find the worst possible scenario, no signal. Typical, I thought, frustrated. I kept walking, hoping to stumble back onto the main trail, but the deeper I went, the more oppressive the forest felt. The vibrant colors that had once filled me with a sense of peace now seemed dull, almost sickly, like the life was being sucked out of the woods. The wind began to pick up, sharp and cold, cutting through my jacket. I tightened it around me as I trudged forward, but the sensation of being watched weighed heavily on me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just the wind, just the natural sounds of the forest at dusk. But then I heard something that didn't fit. A low, guttural growl from somewhere behind me. I froze, straining my ears to hear over the pounding of my heart. It came again, closer this time. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight flickering as I swept the beam through the trees. Nothing. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep calm. There had to be a logical explanation, maybe a stray dog or a coyote. But that growl, it was too deep, too menacing. I quickened my pace, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of me in the now pitch-black forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, and every step I took was met with a snapping twig, a rustling leaf, a phantom breath on the back of my neck. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone was watching, following. That's when I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crashing through the undergrowth behind me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew that was a terrible idea in the dark. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving forward, though every fiber of my being wanted to sprint. Then came the growl again, closer than ever. My flashlight flickered, sputtering in my hand as panic surged through me. I stumbled over a fallen log, pain shooting up my leg as my ankle twisted. I yelped, falling to the ground, the sound echoing through the still night. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the wind stopped. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ankle, and pressed on, hobbling through the forest. The footsteps resumed, faster now, the growl turning into a snarl. Whatever was out there, it was hunting me. I could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze on my back. I pushed through a thicket of trees, branches clawing at my skin, and burst into a small clearing. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe, but the feeling was fleeting. I could still hear it, heavy breathing, the snapping of twigs, closer and closer. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief moments of light, I saw them. Eyes. Glowing eyes reflecting in the darkness, watching me from the edge of the clearing. My blood turned to ice. They weren't human. They couldn't be. The eyes were too large, too far apart, glowing with an unnatural intensity that paralyzed me where I stood. The growl rumbled through the clearing, vibrating the air around me. I forced myself to move, limping toward the far side of the clearing, away from those impossible eyes. But as I reached the edge, something stepped into the light. It was massive, standing on two legs but hunched over, its long, sinewy arms dragging along the ground. Its face, if you could call it that, was a twisted mockery of anything natural, with gaping jaws full of jagged teeth. And those eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, were locked onto me with a hunger that sent waves of terror crashing over me. I ran. I didn't care about the pain in my ankle anymore. I didn't care about the darkness or the unseen branches that whipped at my face. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I heard the thing crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer, always getting closer. My legs were burning, my lungs screaming for air, but I couldn't stop, not with that thing on my heels. The forest seemed endless, the trees all blurring together as I pushed myself to keep going. And then, without warning, I was falling. I had stepped over the edge of a ravine, plummeting into the cold, dark void below. The last thing I remember before the world went black was the sound of that creature's growl, echoing in my ears as I fell into the abyss. It was Jake's idea, of course. A weekend getaway, just the two of us, far away from the city. He found an old cabin online, cheap as hell. Too good to pass up, he said. Romantic, isolated, an adventure. I should have known better. We drove for hours, the Jeep rattling along as we left behind the paved roads and entered the thick, suffocating embrace of the forest. The moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the dirt road ahead. It was barely visible, swallowed up by the trees, but Jake, confident as ever, grinned at me from the driver's seat. We're almost there, he assured me, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. I wasn't so sure. Something felt off, like the woods were watching us. The trees loomed too close, their branches clawing at the sides of the Jeep. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching and shifting under the pale moonlight. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just nerves. Jake reached over, squeezing my hand. "You all right, man? You've been quiet for a while." "Yeah," I muttered, trying to ignore the tightening knot in my stomach. This road looks like it hasn't been used in years. Are we lost?" "Nah, man, we're good. Trust me." Minutes later, the headlights cut through the trees, revealing a small clearing. In the middle of it stood the cabin. I wish I could say it looked welcoming, but it didn't. The place was a wreck. The paint had long peeled away, leaving the wooden boards exposed, gray and rotting. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for us. Home, sweet home. Jake said with a laugh, though even he couldn't hide the unease creeping into his voice. We parked, and as soon as we stepped out of the Jeep, the silence hit me like a physical thing. No birds, no insects, just the oppressive stillness of the woods. Even the air felt thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. I stared at the cabin, its empty windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. Something wasn't right here. I felt it deep in my gut. I wanted to tell Jake we should leave, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I followed him inside. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing the dark, musty interior. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air was stale, like no one had set foot inside for decades. Jake didn't seem to care. He dropped his bag and immediately set to work, lighting the fireplace and unpacking our things. "You should check upstairs," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "See if the beds are still there." I hesitated at the base of the stairs, the darkness above swallowing the weak glow from the fire. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight as I ascended, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I found 2 small bedrooms. Both were bare, save for a couple of ancient mattresses, their fabric torn and stained. I stood there for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it. Faint, barely there, but unmistakable, whispering. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It came from behind the walls, soft and unintelligible, like voices speaking just out of earshot. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, pressing my ear to the cold wood. Nothing. The whispers were gone. I shook my head, trying to shake off the chill creeping down my spine, and went back downstairs. Jake was busy cooking over the fire, the light casting strange, dancing shadows across the room. "Did you hear anything upstairs?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged. "Just old houses making noises, man. Relax. We're miles from anyone. It's just us." I nodded, though the unease gnawing at me only grew stronger. We ate in silence, the fire crackling as the shadows seemed to writhe and stretch across the walls. I kept glancing at the boarded-up windows, half expecting to see something, or someone, peering in from the darkness outside. Later, as we lay in our makeshift bed on the floor, the silence closed in. But it didn't last long. It started with soft creaks, like footsteps moving across the floorboards above us. I tensed, my body rigid. Jake, ever the skeptic, mumbled something about old wood expanding and turned over. But then came the scratching, faint at first, like nails dragging across the walls, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding in my ears. "Jake, do you hear that?" He sighed, annoyed. "It's nothing, man. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The scratching gave way to something worse. Whispers. Louder now, filling the cabin like a chorus of voices, speaking in tones I couldn't understand. I turned to Jake, my breath catching in my throat. He was wide awake now, too, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The whispers grew more frantic, urgent, and above them I heard something heavy dragging across the roof. A slow, deliberate movement, like something crawling just above us. "Jake," I whispered, but before I could finish, the cabin door flew open with a deafening bang. Cold air rushed in, extinguishing the fire and plunging us into darkness. We both scrambled to our feet, terror gripping us as we stared into the empty doorway. The whispers, the footsteps, they were everywhere now, circling us, closing in. And then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. "We need to leave," I finally choked out. But as we reached for the door, a figure stepped into the doorway, its face hidden in shadow, blocking our only escape.